The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like a blanket woven from years of unspoken resentment and casual cruelty. "You're the most useless child we have." My mother's voice, usually a melodic lilt that could charm strangers, was sharp, cutting through the festive hum of the Thanksgiving dinner. It wasn't just a statement, it was a verdict, delivered with the cold precision of a judge pronouncing a life sentence. And the jury? Every single person at that table. My father, my older brother, my younger sister, my aunts, uncles, and even my cousins. All of them stared. Their eyes, usually filled with a performative cheer for the holiday, were now wide with a mix of shock, embarrassment, and a familiar, almost bored confirmation. They knew it was true, or at least they believed it to be, because for 26 years that had been my role, Ilara, the useless one. My name is Ilara, and for as long as I could remember, I existed in the shadow of my siblings' brilliance and my parents' quiet disappointment. My older brother, Daniel, was the golden child, athletic, intelligent, effortlessly charming, destined for greatness. My younger sister, Chloe, was the artistic prodigy, sensitive, beautiful, and adored. And me? I was the middle child, the one who tried too hard, failed too often, and never quite fit into the narrative my family had carefully constructed for themselves. They were the perfect family, and I was the imperfect smudge on their pristine portrait. From a young age, the whispers began, subtle at first. "Ilara, why can't you be more like Daniel?" Or, "Chloe finished her drawing. Why are you still struggling with yours?" It wasn't overt malice, not always, but a constant, insidious chipping away at my self-worth. If I brought home a B, it was compared to Daniel's A+. If I tried a new hobby, like pottery, and wasn't immediately proficient, it was met with a sigh and a suggestion that perhaps I should stick to something simpler. My efforts were never quite enough. My achievements always overshadowed. My very presence often felt like an inconvenience. I remember one particular incident when I was 10. I had spent weeks painstakingly knitting a scarf from my mother for Christmas. My fingers ached, I pricked myself countless times, but I was so proud of the uneven, slightly lopsided creation. On Christmas morning, she unwrapped it, held it up, and a faint, almost imperceptible frown creased her brow. "Oh, Ilara," she said, her voice a little too bright. "How creative. But darling, it's a bit too small, isn't it? And these stitches are quite loose. Perhaps Daniel can use it for his teddy bear." Daniel, who was 14 and far too old for teddy bears, smirked. Chloe, 7, giggled. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, and the warmth of my pride evaporated, replaced by a familiar chill of inadequacy. That scarf, my labor of love, ended up in the charity bin a few weeks later. Daniel's handmade wooden box, crude but functional, was displayed proudly on her dresser for years. My father, a man of few words, rarely intervened. His silence was its own form of complicity, a tacit agreement with my mother's assessment. He was a busy man, focused on his career and providing for the family, but his emotional absence was a gaping hole I constantly tried to fill, always unsuccessfully. He'd pat my head, offer a gruff "good job" for something truly exceptional, but never the genuine warmth or pride he reserved for Daniel's sports trophies or Chloe's art exhibitions. I learned early on that my value was tied to my utility, and since I seemed to possess very little of that in their eyes, my self-esteem withered. School was a struggle, not because I wasn't intelligent, but because the constant barrage of criticism at home had crippled my confidence. I was afraid to speak up, afraid to try, afraid to fail. I became a quiet, withdrawn child, finding solace in books and imaginary worlds where I was the hero, not the burden. My parents interpreted my introversion as a lack of ambition, further proof of my perceived uselessness. "She just doesn't apply herself," my mother would tell relatives, a sigh heavy with resignation. Such a shame. She could do so much more if she just tried. As I grew older, the dynamic solidified. Daniel went to an Ivy League school, then into a high-flying finance career. Chloe pursued art, her pieces gaining recognition in local galleries, her ethereal beauty captivating everyone. And me? I scraped through a state university, majoring in English literature, a subject my mother deemed impractical and a waste of a good brain, if you even have one. I found a job as a copywriter for a small marketing firm, a decent enough position, but one that was constantly belittled by my family. "Still writing those little ads, Alara?" Daniel would ask, a patronizing smile playing on his lips. "Don't you want to do something more substantial?" Every family gathering was a performance. I would brace myself, constructing an invisible shield against the inevitable jabs and comparisons. Thanksgiving was always the worst. It was the epitome of forced family cheer, a day dedicated to gratitude that always left me feeling profoundly ungrateful and deeply alone. This year, it was at my parents' newly renovated house, a sprawling testament to their success. The aroma of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and pumpkin pie filled the air, a cruel contrast to the bitter taste in my mouth. I had arrived early, hoping to help, to make myself useful. I offered to set the table, only to be told, "No, no, Alara, you'll just break something. Chloe has a better eye for aesthetics anyway." I tried to help my mother in the kitchen, but she waved me away, saying, "Darling, you know you're not very good with sharp knives. Just relax, we have it handled." Even my attempts at contribution were rejected, reinforcing the narrative that I was incapable, a liability. As guests arrived, the usual parade of compliments for Daniel and Chloe began. "Daniel, I heard about your promotion. Simply brilliant. Chloe, your latest painting is stunning, darling." I stood in the periphery, a ghost at my own family's feast, offering polite smiles and deflecting questions about my little job. My cousin, Sarah, a kind soul who had always seen me, gave me a sympathetic glance, but even her comfort felt like an acknowledgement of my invisible suffering. Dinner was a cacophony of forced laughter and exaggerated anecdotes. My father, usually reserved, was expansive, regaling everyone with tales of Daniel's business acumen. My mother, beaming, spoke of Chloe's upcoming exhibition. Then, the conversation turned to future plans, to aspirations. Daniel spoke of expanding his investment portfolio. Chloe talked about a residency in Europe. And then, the silence fell, a heavy, expectant void, as all eyes turned to me. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "I've actually been thinking about taking a creative writing course," I ventured, my voice barely a whisper. "Maybe trying to write a novel." It was a dream I had nurtured in secret for years, a fragile hope I was finally brave enough to voice. My mother's smile faltered. Her eyes narrowed, a familiar look of thinly veiled disdain. "A novel, Alara," she scoffed, a tiny, dismissive laugh escaping her lips. "Darling, do you really think you have the discipline for something like that? And honestly, what would you even write about? Your life isn't exactly exciting. Besides, you're not very good at finishing things, are you? Remember the pottery, the painting class?" She paused, taking a sip of wine, her gaze sweeping across the table, inviting agreement. My father cleared his throat. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Chloe looked down at her plate. Then she leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping, but still audible to everyone. It was meant to be a private, motherly admonishment, but she made sure it wasn't. "Honestly, Alara," she said, her tone dripping with what she likely thought was concern, "sometimes I just don't know what to do with you. You're almost 30. Daniel has achieved so much. Chloe is thriving. And you're just there. You're the most useless child we have." The words hung there, suspended in the shimmering candlelight. The clinking of cutlery stopped. The polite murmurs died. The air grew still, heavy with the weight of her declaration. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. My cheeks burned, a fiery blush spreading across my face, down my neck, and across my chest. I could feel every single eye on me, every judgment, every confirmation of my worthlessness. The shame was a physical entity pressing down on me, threatening to crush me. For a moment, I froze. My mind went blank, then flooded with every single instance of dismissal, every cutting remark, every time I had been made to feel small, insignificant, and utterly useless. The knitted scarf, the failed art projects, the ignored achievements, the constant comparisons. It wasn't just my mother speaking, it was the echo of a lifetime of being told I wasn't enough. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. It wasn't a sudden burst of anger, not exactly. It was a slow, deliberate fracture, like a dam cracking under immense pressure. The shame began to recede, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. I looked at my mother, her face a mask of self-righteous pity. I looked at my father, his eyes fixed on his plate, avoiding my gaze. I looked at Daniel, a flicker of discomfort on his face, quickly masked by indifference. I looked at Chloe, her delicate features contorted in a grimace that was more about her own discomfort than any empathy for me. And then I stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor, a harsh, grating sound that shattered the silence. All heads snapped towards me. My legs felt shaky, but I pushed through it. My hands, which had been clenched into tight fists under the table, now rested on the tabletop, trembling slightly. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to sit down, to apologize, to make myself small again, to disappear. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, past the veneer of her perfect hostess persona, into the cold, critical eyes that had judged me my entire life. My voice, when it came, was surprisingly steady, though a faint tremor ran through it. It wasn't a shout, not an angry outburst, but a quiet, firm declaration. "Then stop," I said. The two words hung in the air, simple, stark, and utterly devastating. My mother's jaw dropped, her wineglass paused halfway to her lips. My father finally looked up, his eyes wide with shock. Daniel visibly flinched. Chloe gasped, a tiny theatrical sound. No one had ever dared to challenge my mother, especially me, the supposedly meek and useless one. I didn't wait for her response. I turned, walked away from the table, my heart pounding a furious rhythm against my ribs. I could feel their eyes boring into my back, but I didn't look back. I grabbed my coat from the hall closet, fumbled with the door handle, and stepped out into the crisp, cold November air. The sound of the door closing behind me was not a gentle click, but a resounding thud, like the final punctuation mark on a chapter of my life I was determined to close. I got into my car, my hands still shaking as I inserted the key into the ignition. I drove aimlessly for a while, the city lights blurring through the tears that finally streamed down my face. It wasn't just sadness, it was a torrent of pent-up emotion. Anger, hurt, relief, and a terrifying, exhilarating sense of liberation. I had done it. I had finally said no. I had drawn a line in the sand. The next few days were a blur of intense emotion. My phone vibrated constantly with calls and texts. My mother's messages started with anger. "How dare you embarrass us like that?" Then shifted to guilt-tripping. "We're your family, Alara. How could you be so cruel?" And finally, a hollow attempt at apology. "I was just trying to help you see your potential." My father sent a single terse text, "Call your mother." Daniel and Chloe, predictably, sided with our parents, their messages a mix of concern for the family's reputation and thinly veiled disapproval of my overreaction. I ignored them all. I needed space, desperately. I blocked their numbers, deleted their messages, and for the first time in my life, I felt a profound sense of peace, albeit a fragile one. I knew this wouldn't be easy. Cutting ties with your family, especially one that has been so deeply ingrained in your identity, is like severing a limb. It's painful, disorienting, and leaves a gaping wound. But I also knew it was necessary for my survival. The first step was practical. I found a new apartment, a small, cozy one in a different neighborhood, far from the familiar streets that held so many painful memories. I packed my belongings, leaving behind anything that felt like it carried the weight of their expectations. My old life, or rather the life they had prescribed for me, felt like a heavy cloak I was finally shedding. I started therapy, something I had secretly considered for years. It was terrifying at first, dredging up all the old wounds, the feelings of inadequacy and self-doubt. But my therapist, Dr. Anya Sharma, was a beacon of calm and understanding. She helped me dismantle the narrative my family had built around me, piece by painful piece. She taught me that my worth wasn't dependent on their approval, that my quiet nature was a strength, not a weakness, and that my dreams, however unconventional, were valid. I poured myself into my work, finding a new sense of purpose in crafting compelling narratives for my clients. I enrolled in that creative writing course, not for their approval, but for myself. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and deeply fulfilling. I met other aspiring writers, artists, and dreamers, people who celebrated creativity, who understood the struggle, and who saw potential where my family had seen only flaws. For the first time, I felt like I belonged. The revenge wasn't about making them suffer, though I knew my absence did. It was about proving to myself, and eventually to them, that I was not useless. It was about building a life so rich and vibrant that their judgment became irrelevant. It was about finding my own voice, my own strength, my own happiness. Months turned into a year, then two. My novel, a story about a young woman finding her voice and breaking free from societal expectations, slowly took shape. It was raw, honest, and deeply personal. I found an agent, then a publisher. The day I held the first physical copy of my book in my hands, a wave of emotion washed over me. It wasn't just a book. It was a testament to my resilience, a tangible manifestation of my refusal to be silenced. The irony wasn't lost on me when, a few weeks after my book's release, an email landed in my inbox. It was from my mother. The subject line read, "So proud of you, darling." My first instinct was to delete it, but curiosity, a dangerous thing, made me open it. The email was gushing, filled with effusive praise for my talent and how she always knew I had it in her. She attached a link to a local newspaper article about my book where she had been quoted, proudly claiming me as her daughter. There was even a subtle hint about a family dinner to celebrate. I felt a strange mix of emotions, not anger, not anymore, just a profound sense of detachment. It was like reading about a stranger. The woman in that email, claiming me, was not the mother who had called me useless. Or rather, she was, but her perception of me had changed only because I had achieved something that brought her pride, something that reflected well on her. My value was still external, still conditional. I drafted a reply, then deleted it. I typed another, then erased that too. Finally, I settled on a simple, polite, and firm response. I thanked her for her congratulations, but stated that I was busy with my promotional tour and would not be able to attend any family gatherings. I wished them well. I didn't mention the past, didn't rehash the hurt. I simply set a boundary, calmly and unequivocally. My father tried to reach out a few months later. He had read my book, he said. He sounded different, a little softer, a little more regretful. "Ilara," he said, his voice hesitant, I didn't realize. I'm sorry. We were wrong about you." It wasn't a full apology, not entirely, but it was the closest I had ever gotten from him. I listened, acknowledged his words, but still maintained my distance. The wounds were too deep, the healing still ongoing. Daniel and Chloe, surprisingly, also reached out. Daniel, now facing his own career challenges, admitted to feeling the pressure of their parents' expectations, a burden I had unknowingly shouldered for years. Chloe, in her artistic journey, had encountered her own struggles with validation and self-worth, and she finally seemed to understand a fraction of what I had endured. They offered their apologies, more genuine than my mother's, born from their own recent experiences rather than a desire to claim my success. I cautiously reopened the door to them, not fully, but enough for a tentative, healthier relationship, built on mutual respect rather than a predetermined hierarchy. My mother, however, remained largely unchanged. She would occasionally send an email, a text, always trying to reinsert herself into my life, always with a subtle undertone of expectation. But I had learned to navigate it. I responded on my own terms, or not at all. The power dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the child desperate for her approval, the useless one craving validation. I was Ilara, a published author, a successful professional, a woman who had built her own life, defined her own worth, and found her own happiness. That Thanksgiving, years ago, when I stood up and said, "Then stop," it wasn't just an outburst of defiance. It was a declaration of independence. It was the moment I finally stopped waiting for someone else to see my worth and decided to claim it for myself. And in doing so, I didn't just walk away from a family dinner. I walked towards a life where I was no longer useless, but limitless.